Andrew is going to talk about crew Cantankerous reports for extraordinary weeding. Andrew, Fuerste-Henry.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Andrew Fuerste-Henry. I've talked a lot already. I'm the assistant director at the Dubuque County Library District in Dubuque County, Iowa, a small rural library district serving the unincorporated parts of our county and also 5 small communities in there. And I'm going to talk to you about weeding today. When I started at the Dubuque County Library District, they were just gearing up to get reaccredited, and one of the sticking points in our reaccreditation process was that we were just squeaking by the state mandated minimum percentage weeded out of your collection over the past 3 years. The state says you have to have weeded at least 3% of your collection in the past 3 years. And that was not a bar we had met. For a lot of reasons, like that was all before I was at the library, but I've been given the big rundown of all the reasons why weeding didn't happen over a long period of time, and it makes sense, things happen. But we definitely found ourselves in a place where we needed to think really bigly, yeah, that's the word, bigly about weeding, and needed to kind of see the whole collection in a comprehensive way and kind of get a sense of what sort of task we needed to undertake. Because I started with the accreditation part of it, the like statutory requirement. That's really the least important part of why we desperately needed to weed. Our collection doesn't fit on the shelves very well and doesn't look great on the shelves. And every time I take a shift shelving things, I come back with at least one highly questionable book that I put on somebody's desk and say, could you please reconsider this now? So yeah, it really needed to happen. And that's why I started writing some weeding reports.
Click on my.
Okay, but I really do feel like if I'm going to talk about weeding via report, I need to start with an apology page and acknowledge that reports are a bad way to weed. Like I'm going to show you a report. It gives you a list with a column that says do this. But again, I do feel like I need to spend a little time saying that's not really the workflow I'm endorsing. Really, we're not just slavishly following the computer. We're looking at books and assessing them for local use and all of those things. We're making informed decisions, but we did need some data up front. But every time I talk about weeding with a report, I don't know, I worry that someone's going to jump out from behind a shelf and beat me up. Because it does seem kind of cold and automatic. But that said, so when we started thinking about how much we needed to weed, I went first to my good friends, the Crew Manual from the great state of Texas. I never remember what CREW stands for. It's Continuous Review, Evaluation, and Weeding, I think. And if you've never spent any time looking at CREW, it's a really great resource. This is the CREW method reduced to the most simplistic table in the world. And to go with my previous apology slide, this is not really CREW. The CREW manual is 50 pages of thoughtful consideration of why you should weed and how you should weed and what you should look at as you pick up each individual physical book and think about if you want to keep it or not. And it's great. I highly encourage you to go read it. But for my purposes, the purpose of get a bunch of data, this is the part that was most interesting to me. This is their big table of their baseline numeric suggestions. Maybe zoom in a little bit here. So they go through the Dewey range and then assorted non-Dewey collections and say, in their estimation, you should hold, so let's start with the 004s there. Any book in the 004s, you should weed if it is more than 3 years old. So that's the first number there is years old. Has not been used in more than X years. And you'll notice we've got some mix there. Some of these are X's and some of them actually have a number for use. Or if they're musty. Musty's the part we can't really touch here. And it's an acronym that stands for all of the more nebulous stuff. Is it misleading? Ugly? Oh yeah. This should be a fun game. Does anybody remember what S is? It could be. I mean, it basically boils down to, is this book falling apart, utterly disgusting, or deeply inaccurate, or just like outside of your collection? You know, basically, do you have a reason other than it's old and nobody's checked it out?
Stupid.
Yeah, it could be stupid. Oh, superseded.
I think superseded is S, yeah.
That sounds right. I would believe superseded. Okay, but really, we're worrying about the first two number bits, because that's what we can do math on. And this is a presentation about reports and SQL. And so if we can't do math on it, it doesn't exist. Just another section of their big table. This is where they talk about fiction. Just to kind of show that, yeah, they break that out. It's not all Dewey. And every one of the lines in this big goofy table actually has like a section in their handbook that talks about how they derive these numbers and sort of the logic behind it, which I do enjoy. Again, like this is me hedging my bets to make sure none of you beat me up later for telling you to beat my computer. Okay, so I took that big old table and I wrote a report. Ta-da! This is a list of all of the items in our library. 73,853 of them. I'm excluding a few collections that are weird for one reason or another and don't want to get weeded in this way, but that's pretty much everything we own. That's probably a good number for you all to hold in your brain, sort of relative to your own collection size. I'm going to get to a report here that on my system of 73,000 items takes a second to run. And like, you know, like a web page loading second, where it feels like a really long time. If you have a lot more items than that, this might be a bad idea. We were talking at lunch about all the fun times we've seen Koha servers go down from big reports. This would not crash your server, but you know, it might run out. It might, time out as it's trying to run, and you'll be sad and you'll schedule it to run overnight. Anyway, so this first column in my report, the one called do it, which is do it mangled to rhyme with Dewey. I don't know. If I write a report of any length, I will get bored partway through and start putting dumb names into things. And that's what happens. Okay, but my Dewey column tells you, should I retain this book? Read it for age? That's all I've got on this screen, my first section of OOOs. But yeah, should I weed it for age? Should I weed it for lack of use? Or should I weed it for both reasons? And again, like, I'm intending that as a guideline, a little, as I'm going through this list and I'm looking at this book. What does Crew say I should do with it? Let me weigh that in my calculus there. And absolutely, I have put the date last borrowed in this report and the accession date, the copyright date. So I have the numbers I need here to do this math myself. I sure could like print this out without the do it column and just kind of hold Crew in my head as I go through that, but I don't like to think that hard. If it's just math, maybe make the computer do all the math up front. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how I got Koha to look at each item and tell me what to do with it. And that's a case statement. Sarah talked about case statements a lot. I did tell Sarah after her presentation that she had kind of chomped a fair amount of my flavor here. Sarah and I have been having kind of a brain melt year, I guess, from across the country. My transition slide in our presentation yesterday, where Sarah said that was like how she had driven to college. We went to the same nerdy weird kid college in Iowa, and it shows sometimes. Anybody else has been to Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa? Go Pioneers? Pioneers. I'm told they have sports teams.
My sister-in-law,
Oh, Rhonda's sister-in-law works there.
statistics professor.
She's a statistics professor. If I had paid more attention in statistics in college, I'd be better at this. Okay, so I'm doing a case statement. So like as Sarah was talking about, case gives us a way to basically hard code in what we want the report to say. It's gonna do a little math for us and spit out an answer. So here's the first part. This is where I'm asking it to check whether or not this thing is too old. So I've got a little when the copyright date is less than or equal to. And then we get into the great fun of SQL math, because it's always phrased ridiculously. I kind of enjoy it. So we have to read it from the inside out. We take the current date, and we subtract from it a number of years. So that date sub is do a subtraction of dates. And then it says interval, age, year. I don't know why the word interval is there. It's what SQL likes. We do what SQL tells us to do. And year is saying this many years, subtract this many years. But age is a variable I made myself. So a lot like what Sarah was doing, she was talking about how her subqueries change the names of things and give her like different tables to refer to. I'm going to get to the subquery that takes those crew values and attaches them to each item to give me an age value. So I can take the year that we're in now, subtract out how many years crew says this thing can be old. So if this is in the 004s that said weed anything more than 3 years old, this is going to put in a value of 3 for age. So it'll take 2024, subtract out 3, and say, is the copyright date on this book less than or equal to 2021? If so, it's old enough that you should consider weeding it for age. This is the first of many places where this exact report might not be the best way to do this for your library. I mean, you've probably all got copyright dates in your biblio records. I feel like those are probably pretty accurate in our collection. Kind of thought about using data session instead. Technically, crew is saying do it based on the copyright date, like when this thing was published, not how long ago you bought it. I don't know. There's a lot of dates in koha. Sometimes you just gotta pick one and run with it. Okay, so that's how we check if it should be weeded for age. Oh, I forgot the part where the big parenthetical year around all of it. If I take today's date and subtract out 3 years, I like really specifically get August something. I've been at a conference. 16? Thanks, Wally. I get August 16th, 2021, and I don't want to be that specific. My copyright date is just a year, so I really want to compare years to years. So I use the year function to say, out of this whole date, only keep the year. So really then I'm comparing the copyright year of the book to just a year. Oh, I gave myself a little reminder here that I forgot about. Yeah, so again, 004s, we want anything more than 3 years. We're going to get an age value of 3, subtract that. And I got a real comparable thing for usage. It works a little different for a couple of reasons. First, you'll see that the data from koha that I'm comparing here, I have to work a little harder at. I really want to know about the last time this thing was borrowed. But as you probably run into here and there, items that have never been borrowed don't have a date last borrowed, and so then that gets complicated. Because if I just say, give me everything that was last borrowed more than 5 years ago, that won't find anything that's never been checked out. Because in a like real strict logical sense, something that's never been checked out was not last checked out 3 years ago. Like, yeah, that makes sense. But I know it's a dumb little problem that I have struggled to overcome in various ways in SQL over the years. I think this is my current front runner favorite way to do it, using the koha-US function. Koha-US says, out of this string, like list of values I'm gonna give you, return the first one that isn't null. So on each item, it's gonna look first for, does this item have a date last borrowed? And if it does, that's what we're gonna compare in the rest of our equation. And if it doesn't have a date last borrowed, it's gonna look at data session instead. And if it doesn't have a data session, we've done something terribly wrong. And we're gonna talk to the data folks at Bywater and try to fix our whole database. Okay, so we've got that date and we're gonna compare it to, again, some math. This math gets a little easier. We're gonna take the current date and we're gonna subtract out a number of years. And this time we don't need to then pull the year out of that like we did before, because we're comparing a full date and our date last borrowed or data session to a full date. And this is another place where I have derived my own variable, last circ. And again, this comes out of the crew manual. I've for each item, used that second number in the crew guidelines to figure out when it should have last been checked out to, I don't know, escape the dreaded hand of the weeder. I think I missed a slide. Oh well, we'll come back to it. I do need to eventually talk about how I dealt with those X's. Because every time there's an X, that's crew saying, I actually don't care about this. Don't ever weed an 004 for lack of usage. Only weed it for being too old. On the assumption that like 004s are fundamental important works that you should keep, that's a whole other debate that we can have somewhere else at another time. What are the 004s? That's like library science something, right? I don't know.
Computer programming.
Oh, sure. We should always keep computer programming books, even if nobody checks them out. So obviously, crew is imperfect. All right, so I did all this work that I've kind of hinted at already to get my report to just know how old something can be or when something could last be checked out. And that's not strictly necessary. I could make a report that just asks, that looks at a chunk of my collection and asks, how old can it be and when does it need to have last served? And I can do those as runtime parameters and let that work. And it's fine. Like that's what I've done in the past because as I'm looking at different parts of my collection, I do know I need to apply different standards to different areas. And that's why I can't just write one big report from the get-go. I do need to kind of tailor my approach based on where we are in the collection and how those things get used. And so like this works, I get tired of having to rerun the report and reset those variables and remember what they want to be. So I wanted to like, frankly, I wanted to do all of them. Because I like to do all of them all at once. It's more fun that way. So this is the query I ended up with that lets me do all of them. This over here is the like preview in my code editor that made it small enough that I could take a screenshot that we would begin to show it all to you. And this over here is zoomed in on part of it. The part where I'm using a whole bunch of regex in a case statement to figure out those age variables. Here's my query massively simplified. Basically, You can see way up in line 3 there where it says case and there's a little arrow. I told my code editor to hide that initial case statement. The one that was figuring out the do it value, hide that so we don't have to look at it. And then down here are 2 other case statements, each of which is very, very large and hard to look at. And that's really what makes the whole report so big and scary, is those 2 case statements. And I've given myself little notes there. The first one defines weedable years since update. And the second one defines weedable years since last circ. So these are the parts of my subquery that are finding those crew values and attaching them to each item. And the case statements are not ultimately that complicated. It just kind of took a lot of them and a little bit of pattern recognition. Did you know that call numbers are terrible and messy and inconsistent? We do weird things to call numbers. I mean, like, and I guess in a perfect world, I could make it so the item call number field is only ever just strictly the call number. And we put like our J's and our YAs in some other field and like concatenate them together on our label. And that would make a lot of tech services stuff easy, but make other things harder and more confusing, and we don't really want to do that. So we've got call numbers that are not strictly numbers. So the moment I start trying to ask a report to look at a call number and give me a value based on only the Dewey part, only the 3-digit Dewey part, I've got a little bit of a problem. So each one of these lines is saying, let's just start on the first one. When my collection code is one of my 4 nonfiction collection codes, and we do a regex substring. So this is look at my item call number field and find in it the first string of 3 digits. That's what that //DDD says. This is again a place where your data might need you to do something a little bit different. My cataloger and I sat down for a long time, racked our brains, trying to think of the items in our collection where there would be a 3-digit string somewhere in the call number before the actual Dewey number, and we couldn't think of it. So I think we're okay here. But it is kind of trying to remember. I think Jason talked about regex and how you can destroy everything with it. Jason from Roundup. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, regex is very powerful and very, that's the word I want. Stubborn. It does what it wants to do. But what I'm trying to do here is fairly simple. Look at the call number, get the first 3-digit string out of it. So for any of my adult nonfiction, that's really just the first 3 characters in the call number, because that's how they work. They start with 004 or whatever. It gets a little more complicated in the juvenile nonfiction where it's all J space call number, and the YA nonfiction is YA space call number. I probably could have avoided regex with a lot more words somehow, but I don't know, I put all that time into learning regex, I may as well use it. Okay, so if the first 3 digits out of my call number match the bit on the end. So in that first line, it's saying if the first 3 digits are 101, then 15, matching my table down here. Crew says anything in the 101s, we did if it's more than 15 years old. It gets a little more complicated when we get down into the like Dewey decades. That's the word I want. So like when Crew says anything 150, they really mean anything 150 to 159.9999. And that gets kind of wonky to define in SQL directly. So again, I'm using regex there to say, as the middle line there, it actually says where the first 3 characters match 15 and then a digit. And I don't care which digit. And that's the stuff that I love regex for. See, like when Jason was talking in his presentation on the first day, I thought, oh boy, I've got regex in my slide and I want to show it to him because he can do fun stuff. Yeah, it's hard to give just like a straightforward numeric range that does what you want. That says, give me all the call numbers in the 150s. But regex lets you just say 15 and then a number, and that gets it done for you. Okay, so this is how I broke down the 100s. Case statements are always, you've got a long list of wheres in them, or wins, sorry. It's going to go through them sequentially and take the first one it matches. So my little section of my case statement about the 100s ends with 1 and then any number and then any number, it's a 15. Which is there, snipped off the part of this, where there is somewhere in that table where they say, okay, all other 100s, 15 years old. So that's my kind of catch-all if it didn't fall into one of those more specific categories. So really, I kind of did that for each of the Dewey decades. What does Crew say, like which specific, let me say that, I did that through each of the Dewey centuries. So does Crew say something specific about any of those decades within the century or about any specific numbers? And it needs its own special line, but then one catch-all for anything else in this century, weighted if it's this old. That's the slide I was thinking of. It's just later. Okay, so here's found sort of at the end of that case statement where I had gotten through all the messy nonfiction stuff. Then I did the messy fiction stuff instead. So remember the Crew guidelines that I showed you way up front? They had the big Dewey section and then a sort of a more general fiction-y bit. This is my case representation of that more fiction-y bit. I can say slightly easier things. Like if it's YA fiction, we did if it's more than 3 years old. There are a couple weird ones in there. So the second line down for graphic novels doesn't give a number, it says the year we're currently in. This is what I figured out to work with those X's, where Crew says, I don't care how old this is, keep it, even if it's super duper old. I said, well, okay, we'll just tell it that it needs to be a number of years old equal to the year we're currently in for it to be weeded. So really, like technically this is saying, weed any graphic novel that's more than 2024 years old. We don't have anything in our collection with a copyright date outside of the current era, so we're okay there. This isn't going to tell us to weed anything in our graphic novels by age. I'll be fascinated the day we have a graphic novel that was published BC. And this is the little note I left myself in my report to say, this is how this works, Andrew. You did a weird math thing here. You're not going to remember it later. I'm getting better at leaving myself little sequel notes. I should do more of it, because I definitely did spend some time for this presentation reading this query and figuring out what in the heck I had done 8-9 months ago. Long enough ago that it was no longer in the Bywater Slack archive, alas. So those two big case statements, the one for age and the one for usage, together basically create this table. This is not a report I had ever actually looked at. I never ran this specifically. I don't need this in this form. This is just sort of I've put it here to show you the intermediate step. My subquery makes this table. It says, for every single item in the collection, how old it can, or how many years old it can be to not get weeded, and how many years ago it can have last checked out to not get weeded. So then I took that query and I wrapped it in parentheses and I named it Crew. So at this point, it's kind of like Koha just had a table called crew. And I joined it in, and that's easy. You know how to join in a table. You just have to kind of put out of your mind the part where the word crew there is really a really long parenthetical subquery. I'll refer back again to the screen I had earlier where I was doing this in a code editor. Highly recommended. In theory, I know the whole query I'm writing and I can like scroll through it and read it and know what I'm doing. But there are times when it makes it a lot easier to be able to click a little button and make that whole long thing that I've already figured out just sort of disappear. And then I don't have to look at it anymore. It's not like visual noise. I just understand I'm in a table called crew. That's done. I don't need to think about it anymore. And the query around that is not real complicated. I've still got my case statement hidden up top where I use my age and last cert values to do the math to determine the action you want to take. And it's basically just that. And then like some item information. What's the title? What's the barcode? Derived from items biblio and my small, out of the way, totally manageable and understandable crew table. So that's what let me get this list of my whole collection, which actually isn't like fun, but not very useful. I'm not actually going to ever take this and print it out and take it to the shelf. That would be bonkers. Like by the time I got through the first 1,000 pages of the 3,693 pages of this report, things would have changed. But once I've got this whole thing, once I've taught Koha how to look at my whole collection and think about weeding actions for the whole thing all in one report, and I can do this. And this was really fun. This is for my entire collection. How does that break down? If I were to go out and just like doggedly apply crew with no thought at all, what percentage of my collection would be going out the door? And we found this really helpful in sort of the big picture planning sense of like, I know we need to weed a lot. How much should we really weed? What's the compromise we're gonna make with ourselves and our time and like not making our shelves look like a bomb went off? And this was a nice, for one thing, it was kind of a wake-up call. Like we knew that our collection needed weeding, and then we ran this and said, oh man, we really need to weed. And you know, we did have some staff that needed to be convinced of the need to weed, and I think this helped. So here's the query that made this, and actually, again, it would be very long if I expanded it all out, but if I collapse my case statements, we can see how I've got one big parenthetical here that I've named spew. This was the point where I was getting a little punchy. I wrote this all on a Friday afternoon. Fridays are pretty slow in the workroom at my library. There aren't a lot of people around, so I do tend to fall into a hole and write SQL for a long time. I don't know if you remember this, Christopher, but the day I did this, when I finished it, there was nobody around to talk to us, so I started spamming the reports channel in Slack and just like explaining what I had done because I needed to talk to somebody about it.
I remember that.
And Christopher and Stephen from Ocean State said, oh, this sounds like it could be a conference topic, which I think was a nice way of saying, shut up. Don't have time for this right now. You're going to need to find a captive audience. So congratulations. All right, so if I take that big, complicated query that made my list of every item in my collection and told me what to do with it, and I put parentheses around it and I call it spew, then it's not scary anymore. It's just a table. It's just a table that tells me what to do with my items, and I can take that and do some math on that. So really, if you look at up at the top of this, this is like a real short report. It's just take that do it value group by do it and count up how many items end up in each category. That's as easy as getting a count of items by collection code. No problem. But then I was not content. Because it was interesting to look at the library as a whole, but I really want to get more granular on that. And my collection codes are a good way to get granular in my collection, but not quite good enough. I really do want to, particularly in the nonfiction, kind of get a sense by Dewey Century of how our collection is doing. And that required a little more like deriving of values. My first column here, Dewey, is basically the combination of collection codes and Dewey values. So for all of the adult fiction, that's just, if I scrolled through this report to get to the fiction, that would just be an F. It's just all in one thing. But again, in the nonfiction, I wanted to think about column number ranges. So I needed to do a little work to give each item a value that was OXX, 1XX, and so on through the Dewey values. Because again, if our column numbers were more rational, I could just say group everything based on the first digit. It's not quite there, and it's a little harder. So this is how I made that Dewey value. I said, if the collection code is one of those 4 nonfiction collections, then do some complicated nonsense. If it's not one of those 4 nonfiction collection codes, you could do the easy thing and just grab the collection code itself. It's c.lib because I was getting the display value of the collection code out of the authorized values. But yeah, if it's like fiction, just say fiction and we're cool. But if it's nonfiction, we need to take the item call number, and we're regex substringing again, to find, actually, need to start here. Take the item call number and pull out. I'll first find the part of the item call number that is the first 3 digits, just like we did before. Easy stuff. And then get just the first 1 character from the left. So like in my 005, find the 005 part of the call number, and then give me just the first O. Easy peasy. And then concatenate that together with a couple of X's, because it looked a little neater and easier to think about to say OXX, rather than just here's the O's, here's the 1s. And that's my Dewey value. So here's a very abstract representation of where that whole query is. So this one back here, it gives you a Dewey value and then a column of your action, of your do it action. Counts of how many things end up in each collection or in each action, and then percentages off of there. The OXXs are confusing because they happen to coincidentally have almost exactly 100 items, so that they look a little weird. It tripped me up several times that those numbers were identical. The 1XXs are maybe slightly more indicative of what this is trying to do. I like this. It gives me good granular data. It was a little more complicated, but it's building on what we've done before. So we've got our starting, actually, I forgot I gave myself visual aids, y'all. So we've got our crew query that we did up front, the one that gave us those nice little crew values. That's sort of nested in here. If we were to blow up the whole thing, it'd be real long, but we can just kind of condense it and pretend that it's a table that exists in the database. Crew. And we take those crew values and we use them in that larger query spew. And that gets us the big list of everything we saw before. And then we use that table in this larger query that I call blue, because at that point I was just trying to rhyme things. And that gives us this. That's derive the Dewey value for every item and then group them by that Dewey value. But then I did really want to show percentages in there because I get tired of downloading queries and opening them in Excel, doing the like one column in Excel to put percentages in, which is admittedly easier than accomplishing percentages in SQL most of the time, but feels like a failure in some sense. I should be doing it all in koha, guys. So then I needed one more derived table. Actually, it's a separate query, and that was Bluey, because then I thought about the dog. I'm sorry, I was too lazy to get a picture of Bluey and put him on the screen. Bluey's a girl, right?
Yeah.
I've never seen Bluey, I just hear a lot about Bluey. Yeah, so I've got my big, scary to look at query. It's basically like 4 manageable queries, all kind of nested together. And that Bluey is this. Again, it's like fairly easy to think about by itself. It's just do that Dewey thing I talked about to sort of group everything up and count them. Count from out of our whole collection. Yeah, how many things fall in each of those Dewey categories.
What is AXX?
Oh, that is, that's a cataloging error. Yeah. Normally, I get really excited about those. It's like, ooh, I've got a weird little thing. How'd that get in my report? I've got to stop everything I'm doing and chase it down and find out what it's happening. But when this one came up, it was like, I think last Sunday morning, and I was just trying to make slides, so I forgot about it. It's probably still in here. Okay, so those 4 queries all sort of super glued together give us this big thing. The last like fancy bit in there I want to talk about is our 1xx. You can see that those are green, but not underlined. And that means that they're a link. And that link is not hard to do. This is a link off to another report that is going to take the value out of the field you clicked on and use it as a runtime parameter in the report you're going to. So if you click on OXX, it runs that weeding report for only the things that are in the OXX area. You can see I've got the URL of a run report. That should look kind of familiar if you've poked around much. With where the URL would include SQL parameters, it's instead got that Dewey variable. It's just going to pass that over to the next report. If I ever wanted to go to this report and run it manually, I could do so. I would just type 1xx into that box and it would run that way. Didn't really expect anyone to ever do that. Because I guess if I did, I would put some explanatory text on this field somewhere that would tell staff what to do here, because it's not very intuitive to type in 1xx. But it's really not how I intended this ever to be used. This report exists really just to get linked to from the other one. So then when you link to it, you're just in the 100 specifically, and you're basically getting the same data from that very, very first report, just in a more limited sense. I did end up fiddling this around a little bit to make it show the things that our selectors wanted to see. Because I always make my guesses of the fields they want in a report, and they're always wrong. They always ask them to be in some other order or put something else in there. It's understandable. So really, ultimately, out of all of it, this is the report I expect anyone to look at and print and take off to the shelf. You just went through a lot of reports to get here. And this is that report, basically. It got pretty simple. If it's in that Dewey area, and so we're repeating that long if phrase that made Dewey. If it's in that Dewey area and it's not withdrawn or lost, make it Dewey here. So why did I do this? And why have I made you listen to me talk about it for 46 minutes? Because I think it's neat. So like, then I decided I should probably come up with some closing thoughts and like reasons why I thought this was useful to talk about. So like my advice for tackling overly large and complex queries in SQL. Work iteratively. Like this was very much me starting with, okay, first off, how am I going to take that crew table and make it into a query? All right, I did that. Now, how am I going to use that to do math on a single item? Okay, I did that. Now, how am I going to determine that for a lot of items? Okay. For me, it always really helps to consider the path of my data. Like, this is the part where it gets really visualizing in my brain in a way I have a hard time externalizing. But yeah, I kind of imagine my little friend the data walking through his path and being transformed by each step of my report and slowly massaged into the thing I want. What are the ways in which Koha's basic tables need to be transformed and rejiggered and moved around to end up as the thing I want? And out of that weird long path I made my data walkthrough, my subqueries are signposts. They're bits where I can remind myself what's going on. That would be a great reason not to give them stupid names that rhyme with each other. I was watching Sarah's presentation and she named all of her queries, right? Mr. Query's like, smart things, like, this is age, yeah, okay. Next time. That's utterly a lie. I would get too bored, I think, and just like, I would get lost. I need to make myself laugh, right? It doesn't work. And finally, a code editor and some careful tabbing can make those easier to think about. And really, I learned my lesson about careful tabbing as I was preparing these slides. I had followed my own particular idiosyncratic tabbing routine that made sense to me, but didn't make it easy to collapse the bits I wanted to collapse, which that'll be my takeaway from this presentation. I can get better at formatting my queries to make them play nice with the code editor. But yeah, finding a way to take that big old query and break it down a little bit, make it a little easier for yourself to think about. Because this one in particular is more a long series of simple interactions than, any one particularly terribly complex thing. Just had to bolt a lot of stuff together to make it all go. And that's it. That is the last of my slides. This is my name and my email address. And if you want to talk about SQL, you should come to the koha-US Systems Administration SIG. We meet at 10 a.m. Central Time on the second Tuesday of the month. Do you all have any questions?
Well, I just have a couple of things I'd like to say personally, and then there's some comments online. So I did a presentation about a really complicated bit of SQL at one of the previous conferences. And the quote that Liz said was, "This is spectacular SQL nerdery right here." And I'm going to pass that on to you because this is spectacular SQL nerdery.
So much.
I'm also happy to see the indentations because so many of the reports in our system that predate me are just one line that's like, 40 miles long. So I like that. One of the comments online, though, there was a question, and I think I answered it for them. But the question was, where does V copyright date come from? 008-264. And my response was, it depends on your koha-to-mark mapping. So in your system, it looks like you've got the 264 and the 260, what is it? The 264C and the 260C mapped to, biblio copyright. In my system, that's mapped to biblio items publication here.
Oh, sure.
And so if you're interested in doing something like this, you might need to go look at the koha-US mapping and see where it is that 260C and 264C get mapped to.
If for whatever reason that copyright date doesn't work for you, if it's mapped to something that is not the date you want, you could always get the year out of the 008.
Yeah, you can get the date out of the 008, but that's really a whole nother level of SQL nerdery, right?
And nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, so those were the comments from online mails, so.
The coding blows my mind. But I'm thinking of my people responding to, oh my God, you want us to get rid of half of our items. So tell me where you went from there.
It was a lot of, we've been coming to this report for a good year. Like we had spent the last year really talking about weeding is gonna happen, weeding needs to happen. I think we've been kind of beating that drum and preparing people. And we really did not weed everything crew told us to weed. We probably took about half of it. And maybe we come back next year and take the other half. But yeah, we did have to slow roll it a little bit. I mean, honestly, our patrons would have freaked out. That's to the point where if they walked in someday and the shelves had reduced by that much, they would notice. Like, we took maybe a third of the adult nonfiction out in the branch I'm most often at, and the shelves look really nice, but it's notable. And in a good way. But if we went much further than that, it would start to feel like someone had robbed the library. So yeah, your point is very well taken. This was not something we just popped in front of staff and said, okay, go forth and throw books in the trash.
What code editor do you recommend?
I use Visual Studio Code. It works pretty nice. It's free. It's from Microsoft. The last time I recommended it to someone, they said, I don't use Microsoft programs. I'm like, can't fault them for that.
I love this, 5 stars, no notes. Where do I get the code?
I have not put it on the wiki because it's enormous and scary and it would not look good there. Email me, I would say, or find me in Mattermost. I'm in Mattermost at Andrew FH, if I remember my own screen name properly.
We have 1 million requests for the code.
And again, I'll be fascinated to hear at what size of library it becomes unrunnable. Because it does feel like there is a number of items where it's gonna choke.
No meatball. I want it back there.
But I should say, for your library, you'll probably have to adjust some collection codes and stuff. Part of my basic query says ignore all the interlibrary loans and periodicals and things like that. You have to adjust that. That's pretty easy.
So I don't remember your name and sitting in front of me to the left. Debbie. So what Debbie is saying, about weeding, trying to do all of that at once. You said your criteria for the state was once 3% every 3 years?
I believe that's correct. I could be misremembering it.
Yeah, the NECL standard to be in I forget what we call it, an accredited NECL's library, the criteria is 3% every year. You have to add 4% to your collection every year, and weed 3% every year. And we still have a lot of libraries that don't do that, of course. And so what we try to do when we do a big weed like that is we will go in and we offer to go and help them. And we will immediately delete some of them from the catalog. And then we will say, okay, we're going to change these all to some status in koha so that they no longer show up in the collection in the OPAC. And then we'll delete them next year. We'll actually remove them from the catalog next year. So you automatically on January 2nd, you've already met your 3% for the next year. But that's what we do with libraries too, is they will say, oh my God, if we take all this stuff out, it's going to be everything. We say, no, this is just a starting point. This is just, these are guidelines. They're not rules. It's not policy. It's just a place to start.
I want like a cron job to where you can give it a list of items and it will like delete 2 a day, every day. Just sort of trickle them out, nobody will ever know.
Everything from Michelle.
Yeah,
I will add to that comment, or the question about, did you do this all? Along the same lines, we had a situation where we weren't getting rid of our expired patrons. They were just sitting there in limbo and our patron counts just went up. And I told everybody, we need to purge all these expired patrons that aren't getting renewed and used. And there was a lot of eyebrows raised at that. And it is a hard step to take. And when we did pull the trigger and purge those, there was a lot of, where are our patrons? Where are our patrons? And all I explained this, these are patrons that haven't been doing anything. You're going to have to pace yourself at that, but the leap between what's active and what's inactive is a hard leap. But if you maintain that cycle, if you perpetuate, what you're trying to accomplish, then you're not going to hit that year after year after year. If you're remaining inactive and not doing anything, then nobody's going to notice. If you remain active and keep doing the same thing, nobody's going to notice. It's just that initial step that really is hard.
I should have included in this presentation a picture of my backyard for a nice weeding metaphor of my backyard is a giant mess and it stresses me out every time I think about it. And someday I'm gonna just go crazy and burn it all down. And if I were like a good responsible homeowner, I'd be doing that continuously. Like the C in crew stands for continuous, because you do a little bit all the time and it never gets so bad that you freak out about all those shrubs, man. Or books.
Sorry, Bob. You're gonna get your steps then together just.
I think the other thing to consider, as far as, we're pulling all this stuff out at once is when you hire new staff, if you can remind them that collection development also doesn't include just purchasing books, but also includes weeding. It's make it part of the process, and that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons we end up with libraries that are full of stuff is because people think of buying books as fun. And when you think of collection development just as adding materials, and the next thing you know, your shelves are bursting and you need a big weeding project like this. So it's much easier if you just do it continuously. Thanks, Bob.
I once worked for a library who had a former board member who ran a pig farm and had an industrial shredder, and he would take all of their withdrawn books and shred them and use them as pig bedding. And I miss that guy. That was in Illinois, actually. But yeah, there are days where I think, man, I need a pig farmer with a shredder. People are going to see these books in the dumpster. They're going to be mad. On that note.